I'm Lars Andersen with Adventure Outpost. I do river tours all over North Florida. Do about almost 80 different waterways all over North Florida, 2 or 3 every week. Been doing about 25 years. This is my 25th year of doing these tours. I've been writing about Florida for almost 40 years. But yeah, we do tours all over. Most of our waterways are spring-fed in North Florida here. Today I'm out with some of the staff from ACT, looking at Santa Fe River and some of the springs along the way, talking about some of the importance of these waterways and the springs and the connectivity of what makes it all work and why everybody living along these rivers are connected. You know, it's one big happy family that rely on each other. And Santa Fe River that we're exploring today is really the heart of the springs heartland of Florida. We are in this world-class mecca of springs in North Florida here, unmatched anywhere in the world. 1,021 springs measured so far. We're just in this incredibly rich habitat full of springs that define what this land looks like and what our rivers look like. All of it's so spring fed. If we didn't have the springs, this would just be a very different North Florida. The idea today is to kind of go down the river, talk a little bit about some of the springs, what makes them so unique and so important, and just take it from there, see what we can see going down the river. So we'll make our way on down. Florida is just situated on this limestone plateau, the whole state up into Georgia, which formed many millions of years ago under a shallow sea, very shallow. And the shallowness is important because it was warm, a lot of sea life living in there. All those creatures for millions of years died, settled to the bottom, compacted over the years, and just built and built to where you had a couple 1,000 feet thick layer of all these old shells and animal parts. And eventually, as things moved around, the oceans shifted and continents, the Florida plateau came out from under the sea, and now rainwater, which is a little acidic compared to limestone, rainwater can now seep into this limestone and start to dissolve it and eat away into the limestone, create these channels, underground conduits. And so it's really rainwater that's created this sort of karst environment that we call this, with all the springs and sinkholes, this kind of irregular limestone. Rainwater did that, just chemically eroding it. And so in the last couple million years, after this system was already in place, during the ice ages, shore levels came and went a bit. During the low water periods, when there was the ice caps, sea levels were much lower. The shoreline of Florida was about 100 miles offshore from where it is now. But interior Florida was very dry and cool at that time. Every time there was one of these cool-offs. And then it would warm up, shore level would come in. When people first arrived 15,000 years ago, it was during one of those cold spells. It was the very end of the last ice age, 15,000 years ago or so. Those dates change, probably will change again. But at this point, it's about 15,000 years ago. We're in this dry period. These channels were already formed by that process I was talking about, but they were, for the most part, pretty dry. So this would have been just a relatively dry riverbed, might have filled when it rained and things like that. But for several thousand years, when people were first here, it was that way, very dry state. The bigger springs would have just been these deep water holes. And so for those first people, those springs were really important. And so the majority of the early Paleo-Indian sites that have been found in Florida are near springs for that reason. They're just these very important water holes. But slowly coming out of the ice age, 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, maybe 9, spread out over time, the water table rose. It was warming, and finally the springs rose, overflowed their banks, and filled into the old channels again. And now those early people had a way to move. They could now canoe and paddle down instead of having to walk over this dry sandy ground. They had more fish, so their life ways changed completely. They now could be much more sedentary and make villages, and the cultures just changed. Now they had a lot more resource and ways to travel around. And so that was really the beginning of this kind of Florida that we know, with the rivers and very wet and springs flowing everywhere. This kind of Florida has only been here about half the period of time that humans have been here, which is significant, really. The Santa Fe is the perfect river, really, to study springs and get a good look at the springs sort of ecosystems, because there are so many in this. Between the Santa Fe and the Swanee River that this flows into, there are more springs, like I said, than anywhere. There's about 314 in the springs basins and nearby, and basically sort of all grouped together when they're studying these things. But the reason for that, we're just uniquely situated at the edge, the bottom side of an old shoreline of Florida from 125,000 years ago, I believe. The Cody Escarpment. So if you explored Florida and into geology, you know about the Cody Escarpment. It's a very important defining feature of Florida and our natural systems out here. But we're on the downside edge of that thing, which would have been shallow sea at that time. And just by kind of washing over the limestone that was created millions of years before that, by washing all that, kind of exposed cracks and vents in the limestone, and we just have this ideal situation for these spring vents. And the same with the Suwannee River. This ancient Cody Scarp goes crosses the Santa Fe above us here, and then crosses the Suwannee. You know, so below that escarpment on the Suwannee and Santa Fe, you just get all these springs on here, as well as swallow holes, which is where the water goes into the ground. Which little awesome swallow that we're going to see later. That's one of the swallows on this river. But just in general, an excellent river for studying springs, probably the best of any. Sawdust, this 139-acre property, not only has this third magnitude spring, but has this nice kind of wetlands around it too, which is just vital for conservation of the river and the systems. You know, you get a nice buffer between uplands and the rivers that absorb some of the runoff and things like that. Flood waters are mitigated by having these wetlands. So, you know, a lot of times people think about preserving rivers and springs as just the waterway, but preserving the land around them is critical to that. And we're losing so many of those wetlands anyway. But in recent decades, the importance of these kind of wetlands has become much more known and understood and appreciated. So purchasing properties like this around the spring is really important to the overall efforts to conserve Florida. So as we've been making our way down the river, we've passed all these beautiful springs, and that's a very big part of North Florida's ecosystem, overall ecosystem. But the main river that we've been paddling has been dark water for the most part. And that is by far the most common water type in Florida, river type. It just gets that dark color from the vegetation. As it dies, it has tannic acid in it, which is dark brown, just like the tea you drink. That's tannic acid. And it just leaches out of plants, makes its way into the rivers, and it's natural, it's healthy, it's a little acidic. That's kind of contributes to eroding the limestone too. That's why we have the dark water main river, clear water feeding into it from the springs. And so with that clear water, you get all those plants. So you have snails, just a lot of animals that can live in that clear water. And the calcium also, it's picked up a lot of calcium under the ground. So the calcium is great for shell production of a snail shell, but also turtle shells. And for that reason, these spring-fed rivers, the Santa Fe, Itchituttony, have just a really incredible richness of turtles, these freshwater turtles. There's 11 native species on this river, 3 or 4 exotic non-native species also. But that's a pretty large number of species of turtles on one waterway. It just kind of helps speak to that story of that clear water just feeds a really incredible dynamic system. Okay, so now we're at Myrtle's Fissure, or Myrtle's Crack, which is probably the lowest, farthest down spring that we're doing in this section today, going down towards Highway 47. The last larger spring. There's some other vents as we go further down. But beautiful linear spring. Right now we have this exposed limestone, beautiful flow. The main crack is back over there, kind of a linear vent. If you go back into the forest area, you'll see this kind of series of sinkholes associated with that, like an extension of the spring itself, of that feature, which is common with a lot of these springs we see going down the river. You'll see some related features going off into the woods. You know, some sinkholes, pretty obviously in a line, just kind of reflecting an underground conduit there. But yeah, here we've got this exposed limestone. We're sitting right on top of this limestone aquifer. We have some beautiful plants, a little pimpernel here. This is water pimpernel, a little white flower, and then some white bracted sedge, some bog hemp. You know, so a few nice little kind of wetland plants, a little bit of dollarweed, pennywort, this kind of thing. But kind of creates this nice little rock garden in here at this water level. It's fantastic. But this is part of that last parcel that ACT bought. That includes Little Awesome, Swallowette. You know, Myrtle's Fissure has its own look, just like every one of them do. They all kind of have their own distinct appearance, but it's really more than that with these springs. Every one of them is very unique. The chemistry is a little bit different. nothing real dramatic, but they are different enough to where in many of the springs, unique species have evolved right in that spring, even though it might be completely connected to the main river. Like Coffee Spring on Itchitutney has a snail that's evolved right there. So every one of these has its own personality, its own chemistry, its own story, its own history, human history, plants and animals that live there, and they each add something unique to the river itself, altered. So it's not just one of many springs that are just all adding the same water. It's each one is its own unique source of water. You know, so if you took any one of these springs away from this river, the river from here on down would be a slightly different river. All right, so this is the last stop on our spring hop down the river. We've been passing a number of springs down this trip. Jenny Springs Group, privately owned, some state-owned property at Gilchrist Blue, and some county parks like at Rum Island and Post Spring. ACT property like this one and some of the other features we've seen before here. So it's nice. It's been a nice sort of sampler of all the different communities working together to save this river. I think if the more all the stakeholders and owners along the river can just embrace the fact that they're all one big community rather than a series of individual entities, and speak with one voice, sort of a holistic approach to the whole conservation and speaking for the river. The more we can do that, the better. Just like the river communities, the people communities can do the same thing. Well, thanks for coming down the river with us. Stay tuned for other things down the road. You can go on tours with me down the road or other ACT events in the future.